Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at our Ghirapur Orrery deck, which was the deck that you guys voted on that won. Well, it kind of won. It tied for first place with Energy, which we will play at the end of the week. But I was super excited to play around with this card because it's so fun, and it was really hard to build, I'll be honest. Tried many different shells to put it in. Mono Green Stompy was the one that pretty much had the array in it from the beginning, but it kind of felt a bit half-assed because I already had the deck built around it. So I've actually gone with a little bit of a special deck in this case, playing with the extra land drop and stuff like that, and also taking advantage of stuff. But anyway, what is Ghirapur Treats? Let's have a look-see. So we are building around the card Ghirapur Orrery. So this is a 4-mana artifact. At the beginning, each player may play an additional land on each of his or her turn. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. So we have ourselves a symmetrical card. So this card, without building a deck specifically around it, is a really bad card. Which is why I wanted to play it. As you all well know, I enjoy playing with bad cards. So, each player gets to play additional cards, so that does include our opponent. But with symmetrical cards, what we're essentially trying to do, as a little bit of an insight into deck building, essentially what we're trying to do with a symmetrical card is get more benefit from it than our opponent. We're essentially playing the odds in this sense. So, we want to play more lands than our opponent, and we want to empty our hand more often than our opponent. So we're trying to do both of those things in this deck, and we are taking advantage of those in several different ways. So, to take advantage of playing additional lands, we are running a lot more lands than we normally would. We're running 27 lands, as well as fetches in there as well with our Evolving Wilds. So we're essentially going to play more lands than our opponent, so statistically, unless our opponent is playing a ramp deck, we are going to play 2 lands more often than they do. Pretty good. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if they have no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. So we need to empty our hand quicker than our opponent. So we have ways of emptying our hand. Mostly just in the way that the game runs, you know. Towards the turn 7, 8 area, you're going to be running low on cards anyway. But to help that along the way, we have things like Olivia's Dragoon, which allows us to discard cards to give her flying. We can do this as many times as we want. So with Olivia's Dragoon on the board and the Ghirapur Orrery, we can discard our entire hand whenever we want and draw 3 cards. So we could be drawing 3 cards every single turn. So that is how we're going to take advantage of the Ghirapur Orrery. As I mentioned, it is a symmetrical card, so there is the chance and, you know, fairly likelihood that our opponent can take advantage of one of these themselves, but it is our duty to try do it more often than they do and come out with something pretty sweet. And what we've got is a pretty awesome little late game deck that sort of stays alive for a very long time until your opponent runs out of steam, and that's when we gain traction. So, let's go to the beginning of the deck, shall we? Primal Bella, a great card for pumping up creatures and giving your creatures +1/+1 for each forest you control for 1 mana. So, this is a great little pump spell because, 1, we can give Olivia's Dragoon flying to get over the top, play a Primal Bella, and in our deck we have 8 forests. So, for 1 mana we can have up to +8/+8 on our Primal Bella, which is pretty awesome. And if your opponent doesn't block one of your creatures, it's likely going to be the game if you have this card in hand. And for 1 mana, it's easier to empty our hand out as well if we want to get the array online. Pretty sweet. As I mentioned, Olivia's Dragoon, 2 mana, 2/2. We can discard a card to gain flying until the end of the turn, so we can empty our hand whenever we want at instant speed. So at the end of our turn, if we haven't used the cards in our hand and we have no interest in using them, we might want to redraw, for example. We'll discard our entire hand, draw 3 cards with the array. It's pretty much the idea. We're only running 2 though, because I don't really want to be discarding our hand constantly. So just having 1 at a time is usually good enough. We have ways of getting Dragoon back as well as finding her as well. So It's not too important that we go for the full 4 or the full 3, for example, but if you want to go more into the discard section, I would advise adding more of these guys in. Moving on, we've got Sylvan Advocate, a 2-mana 2/3 with Vigilance, and as long as you control 6 or more lands, Sylvan Advocate and land creatures you control get +2/+2. So we are taking advantage of the extra land drops. Hopefully we can get Sylvan Advocate online quicker than our opponent can get their Sylvan Advocate online. And we also have man lands as well. So we have a lot of tap lands, but since we can play 2 lands each turn, it doesn't really matter that our lands enter the battlefield tapped. And we can get some benefit out of them as well. So that is why we are running Sylvan Advocate. It's pretty sweet. Nature's Way. This is essentially Rabid Bite, but strengthened up to an unbelievable rate. So, for 1 and a green, sorcery speed, target creature you control gains Vigilance and Trample until the end of the turn, and then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So this is essentially Rabid Bite from the previous sets, but with the added bonus of giving our creatures Vigilance and Trample. So we don't have many creatures in our deck, but what we do have is the ability to make our creatures very big. So this is a 2-mana removal spell, essentially. We have things like the Gitrog monster as well. And if Gitrog monster deals damage to a creature, thanks to Death Touch, no matter how big it is, Death Touch kicks in and will kill it. We also have things like our Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger and our Oran-Reef Hydra that can just get out of hand very quickly. So it's fairly common that we'll be able to get some advantage out of this. And if we can't, discard it to Olivia's Dragoon and draw 3 cards later on. This is pretty sweet. Then we have Nyssa Vastwood Seer. So this 2 and a green, 2/2 legendary creature. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So we get to fetch out extra lands for our retreats, for example, and our Ghirapur Orrery. Also allows us to trigger our Oran-Reef Hydra and things like that. So we've got a lot of synergies in this deck as well. There's a lot of little combos, which is pretty sweet. And yet again, we're going to try take advantage of dropping more lands than our opponent. So whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, you get to exile her and return her to the battlefield as Nyssa Sage Animist. So she comes in as a 3 loyalty planeswalker. Her +1 ability, for those who don't know, is to reveal the top card of her library. If it's a land, we get to put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, we put it into our hands. So it's card advantage either way, but it's also ramp if we hit a land, which is pretty sweet. Her -2 is the ability to protect herself. We get to put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token called Ashaya, the Awoken World, onto the battlefield. So she can protect herself when she comes down. If there's one creature on our opponent's side, or we need to block an extra 1 creature to keep her alive, then we can do the minus ability to keep her alive for that. And her -7, her ultimate ability, to untap 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures. They're still lands, which means Sylvan Advocate gets to give them +2/+2. Not that it matters, because they're just going to be absolutely massive anyway. They're going to be 6/6 regardless. So that's 6/6/6s attacking your opponent. It's very likely going to kill them. I can't say I've ever ultimated Nyssa and not won off the elemental tokens, so it's pretty sweet. Then we've got Tireless Tracker, yet again, taking advantage of those land drops. So for 2 and a green, we have 3/2. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, we get to investigate. So we get to put a clue token onto the battlefield, which allows us to draw cards, lots of card advantage. And when you sacrifice a clue, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Tireless Tracker, which means that we can make Tireless Tracker very big very quickly. Another synergy with Tireless Tracker is these clue tokens actually help with Inventor's Fair, because Inventor's Fair, whenever we have 3 or more artifacts or Metalcraft, don't know why they didn't put Metalcraft there, but there you go. We gain 1 life every single turn. It's not a great advantage, but it does allow us to maybe get out of the way of some burn spells or something like that. But yes, we're going to be dropping a lot of lands. We might be dropping 2 a turn, and especially if we're sacking the clues as well, we're going to be able to find extra lands. So Tireless Tracker, likely to get out of hand quite fast. Then we've got the way that we plan on winning and staying alive, mostly. Retreat to Hagra. So for 2 and a black, we have Landfall. So whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, We get to choose one of the two modes. Likely we're going to be choosing each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So we have plenty of land drops. We're going to be draining our opponent just for playing lands, as well as getting clue tokens, flipping our planeswalkers, you know, that kind of thing. Pumping up our pump spells. It just synergizes so well. The other ability is not too relevant, though we probably will end up using it. So if we have a very measly Sylvan Advocate, a 2/3, you know, nothing too scary, and our opponent has some sort of 7/7 trampler or something like that, we can actually kill it by playing landfall. We can give our creatures +1/+0 and give them death touch until the end of the turn. We have ways of doing this at instant speed as well, with Evolving Wilds, so we get to sacrifice a land and put it onto the battlefield, which will trigger our landfall. We can also Drownyard Temple as well to pull one back from our graveyard if there's one there to do it. So we have plenty of ways of doing this at instant speed and getting a little bit of a combat trick out of it as well. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. Moving on, we've got Retreat to Kazandu. This is the other side of our retreats package. So for 2 and a green instead, we have Landfall and 2 modes again. A top mode allows us to make our creatures a lot bigger. Every single land gets a +1/+1 counter on a target creature we control. So that's pretty sweet. And the other one is gain 2 life. So with the gain 2 life, a lot of the time, if you have plenty of retreats out, you're going to be on 20 life constantly. So most like aggro decks that run out of steam are going to really struggle to get through the life gain that this provides. We're going for the full 3 as well, so we're properly going down on the retreats. And with our Ghirapur, we're going to be able to trigger them 2 times per turn. With the Evolving Wilds, do it at instant speed, that kind of thing. So yeah, with these guys on the battlefield, it's going to be hard for our opponent to do much about it, really. Unless they've got a super mega horrible board that we can't deal with also. Moving on, we've got Murder. So for 1 and 2 black, instant speed, targeted removal, destroy target creature. So this is just hard casted removal. Speaks very much for itself. There's not much to talk about here, really. Get rid of a big creature or a pesky one. We have Pulse of Marasa, so for 2 and a green, we get to return target creature or land from the graveyard to its owner's hand, and you get to gain 6 life. So, many times I've used this little combo, but for those who don't know the combo, with Pulse of Marasa, we can get back Green Warden, for example. Green Warden, when it enters the battlefield, you return a card. If you return the Pulse, then when the Green Warden dies, you pulse back the Green Warden, grab the Pulse, and you just cycle every single time Green Warden dies. Essentially, you gain 6 life. So there's a little combo with that. We can also use it to get back our big creatures. We can get back like Tireless Trackers and our Ulamogs and stuff like that. So our big horrible creatures that get bigger and bigger and bigger, we can just keep returning over and over again. The reason why it's only a 1-of is because we have things like Diabolic Tutor, so we're not going to be using it too much. And we also have things like Nyssa as well, who has a -3 ability to get back permanents. So Pulse isn't terribly important to have as more than a 1-of, but if you want to gain that life gain, also life gain's not too important when you've got 3 retreats in your deck as well. So it's just a 1-of. If we want to fetch it up and start doing the combo with the Diabolic Tutor, for example, then we can start doing that. Otherwise, we can grab lands and things like that to trigger retreats. Just gets out of hand. Ghirapur we've spoken about. Should mention there's also a different way you can play the Ghirapur Array. So we're playing the landfall base that's trying to take advantage occasionally of drawing 3 cards. But what you can actually do is focus more on the drawing 3 cards. So if you play things like Reflector Mage, for example, you can keep your opponent off of drawing these 3 cards, and therefore you can kind of tempo your opponent out. If you bounce their creatures, if your deck is based around filling their hand up and emptying yours in the process, then you can just tempo your opponent out with the array. So that's another way to play it if you want to try that deck out. I didn't have a great deal of success with it, but I didn't try it too much, and I was pretty tired, pretty hungover. Not hungover, sorry. Jet lagged. I don't know why I said hungover. I was hungover the other day, but there you go. Anyway, moving on. Languish. 2 and a black. Most of you know this. All creatures get -4/-4 until the end of the turn. It's a board wipe. A board wipe that doesn't hit many of our creatures, I should point out. Gitrog Monster doesn't hit. Does hit the Green Warden, but all we have to do is put a counter on it with Retreat, and it doesn't hit him anymore. Ovenwald Hydra is going to be a 6/6. Urn Reef Hydra is going to be a 5/5. Ulamog, yep. So it's a board wipe that doesn't affect our side, essentially. So we can get a lot of advantage out of that. And if the meta turns towards focusing on Kaladesh cards, then there's going to be a lot of Thopters hanging around as well. So this is just going to wipe the crap out of them. They're not going to be able to do much about it. So we're going to see. So that's Languish. We have Diabolic Tutor. This is the only reason this deck works as efficiently as it does. Because for 2 and a black sorcery speed, search your library for a card and put that card into your hand and shuffle your library. So it's a 4 mana, get whatever card you want. So if we don't have our array and we can get some advantage out of it, we can search it with Diabolic Tutor. If we want to gain the combo of Pulse and Green Warden, we can go search for it. If we're at 10 mana and we don't have Ulamog yet, we can go grab him. So there's plenty of advantages. This is one of the reasons why I went into splashing black, mostly. For the Diabolic Tutor to grab the array. We have, in theory, kind of, we have 6 different Ghirapur arrays. We have the 2 Ghirapur arrays themselves. We have Diabolic Tutor to grab them. And we have 2 Inventor's Fairs to search for them as well. So we can always grab Ghirapur array whenever we want. But Diabolic Tutor also allows us to get whatever else we want. So we can get that Languish if we need it. We can get our game-winning creature if we want it. You know, that kind of thing. Grab our Planeswalkers if they're useful. If the board's empty, for example, we might want to try and go for Nissa's Ultimate, which I will get to in a moment. So yeah, Diabolic Tutor is just absolutely awesome. Going to see a lot of this card, I reckon. I can't see why we wouldn't. It's just a 4 mana. Grab whatever card you need in that current situation and screw your opponent over. So there you go. We then have the Gitrog Monster. For 3, a black and a green, we have a 6/6 death-touching legendary frog horror creature with an arm in its mouth, and that just speaks highly of this card. So at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a Gitrog Monster unless you sacrifice a land. So we get to sacrifice things like our Drownyard Temples, and our Drownyard Temples have the ability to come back from our graveyard to the battlefield, so we get land drops off of our retreats, and then we get to sack it to the Gitrog Monster again, so we get a lot of advantages out of that. But why do we want to sacrifice? That seems really bad. Well, whenever one or more lands are enter the graveyard from anywhere, so even if we sack an Evolving Wilds, for example, we get to draw a card. We do also get to play an additional land on each of our turns, and that one is not symmetrical like the array. So only we get to draw an additional, play an additional land. So with the Gitrog Monster and Ghirapur array, we can play 3 lands per turn, which is 3 retreat triggers. Absolutely bonkers. So that's the kind of thing we want to go for. So yes, and if we ever don't want him anymore, we can just sacrifice him and maybe get him back later with a Pulse or even our Nyssa, for example. Really awesome. Perfect for the deck. Moving on, we've got Nyssa Vital Force. So for 3 and 2 green, we have a 5 loyalty Planeswalker who's very interesting because she gets the ultimate in 2 turns. So her +1, which is pretty much where you want to go first time. Untap target land you control. Until your next turn, it becomes a 5/5 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. So we can plus up to our ultimate level the moment she comes out. Get ourselves a 5/5 creature that can protect Nyssa. That will block most things in the format. It also sticks around, unlike Chandra's elemental tokens, it sticks around to keep her safe. So we can either keep the 5/5 back, but if the board's empty, then we can send it at our opponent and dealing 5 damage, which is quite brutal. So that's the kind of thing we want to do. -3 ability. Not going to be using it too much, but if our opponent gets rid of our Ghirapur array, for example, and we want it back, we can -3, return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand. So we have a lot of permanents. We can also grab our Evolving Wilds back as well to get 2 extra triggers off of our retreat, so there's a synergy there. The main reason we want to play her, though, and it happens fairly often, Her -6 ability, whenever you get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So, picture this. We've just ultimated our Nyssa. We have a couple of retreats on the battlefield and a Ghirapur Orrery. We play a land, we draw a card, we trigger our retreats. That card that we draw into is another land. Guess what? We can play it. We get more retreat triggers, we draw more cards. And Gitrog Monster doesn't lose as lands anymore, because when we play it, we draw more cards, and we play more lands, draw more cards, and we start filling our hand up. Pretty soon, the second half of the Ghirapur Orrery is very irrelevant to us, because we're drawing more cards than we know what to do with anyway. So we can essentially get out of hand with Nyssa's ultimate. So it's really awesome, and in playtesting, I have ultimated a fair few times, and it works perfectly every time. It's beautiful. So that is Nyssa. Really awesome card. Then we have Green Warden. We have spoken about you briefly, but 4 mana and 2 green for a 5/4. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Absolutely any card we want. Could be a land, could be a planeswalker, could be a Debolic tutor to tutor up whatever we want. Could be the array we might have just lost, or it could be the Pulsar Marassa so we can start comboing off. Really awesome. And when he dies, we can also exile him to do the exact same thing if we choose to do so. But if we've got Pulse hanging around, you don't want to exile to grab a card. You want to get that Pulse back and keep cycling those Pulses. 6 life every turn. It's pretty awesome. But yes, Green Warden grabs us whatever we want. Just, yeah, speaks for itself, really. Then we have the Ulvenwald Hydra. 4 and 2 green. It is a reach creature with XX power and toughness that is equal to the number of lands we control. Guess what? We're playing a lot of lands, so we're going to be getting a lot of triggers. However, the main reason you play Ulvenwald Hydra, other than it being big, fat and stupid, is that when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a land card, not basic land, land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. So if we haven't got an array by turn 6, we could grab the Inventor's Fair, which will allow us to go get our Ghirapur Orrery. Most of the time what we want to do is grab Rogue's Passage, so for 4 mana, target creature can't be blocked. So that will be a 7/7 unblockable creature from that point on with Reach as well. Reach is actually quite important with this new set, since Thopters are probably going to come back with a vengeance. Having Reach will allow you to block a few of them as well. Some of the bigger flyers, things like that. So it's really cool, and we can grab whatever land we do. When we grab the land, of course, we trigger our retreats, and maybe even we want to grab our Drownyard Temple if Gitrog Monster's out as well, so that Gitrog Monster has a better option to sacrifice lands to. But yes, awesome. Then we've got Oran Reef Hydra, 4 mana and 2 green for a 5/5 trample. That's pretty good on its own. It's not fantastic. However, it does have the landfall ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Oran Reef Hydra. However, if that land is a forest, you put 2 counters instead. So Oran Reef Hydra can get out of hand very fast. If we're playing like 2 lands per turn as well, that's 2 counters minimum. But if they're both forests, that's 4 counters maximum. And, you know, we get Gitrog Monster, we get additional land drops. If those are Evolving Wilds, we get triggers off the Evolving Wilds into the forests. So we're getting +3/+3 off of that. The landfall on this Oran Reef Hydra gets pretty bonkers. So this is another way that we can get a lot of damage over our opponent, no matter what they've got. You usually can't block all this damage, and we get trampled through and get a lot of value out of it. Absolutely awesome. And finally, Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. If you're playing a lot of lands, you're going to need to play Ulamog. 10 mana for a 10/10. Whenever you cast him, he exiles 2 target permanents. So if it's mill, you exile their tutelages. If they've got an Ulamog on the battlefield, you exile their Ulamog. Whatever game-winning situation they're in, you exile it, essentially, and you get yourself an indestructible 10/10. But that's not all. Whenever he attacks, your defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library, which means even if Ulamog dies on the attack out of some sort of sacrifice effect, like Blessed Alliance, for example, you still exile the top 20 cards of your opponent's library, which is pretty insane. It just speaks for itself. Actually, you know what? There's argument to have ourselves... Hang on. A creature of... I can't remember what value. Oblivion Sower. I might put Oblivion Sower in here, actually. Oh, we're going live stream for our thingamajig. Let's go with... I think we'll just cut off an Oran Reef Hydra for that. So, Oblivion Sower. The reason why I'm going to add this in is because he has a very cool combo with our Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Essentially, when Ulamog exiles 20 cards off your library, if you cast Oblivion Sower after it, then Oblivion Sower exiles 4 cards, then you take any number of lands your opponent owns, and you put them onto your battlefield. So, if you exiled 20 cards and 10 of them were lands, that's 10 triggers on the retreats and both retreats. It's 10 triggers on the Hydra and stuff like that. So, that's actually... I forgot to add that in. I really should have done. But yes. And, you know, the more lands we have as well, the easier it is to empty out our hand as well to draw 3 more cards. So once we're at full swing, we're pretty much good to go. But yes, that's the deck essentially. So moving on to the land base, it's pretty simple. We have 7 swamps and 8 forests. We're running more forests than swamps because we're running more double greens than double blacks. And also, Oran Reef Hydra benefits from forests entering, and Nyssa grabs basic forests. So we have a lot of... And also, as well, Primal Bella benefits more from it. I would skew this more in the way of forests if we weren't running so many double blacks at turn 4 and turn 3. So that's the reason it's more evened out, is because you want double black towards the early game. So we're kind of losing out a little bit of synergy with not running more forests, but we are getting consistency instead, so, you know. And then we've got Hissing Quagmire, so it enters the battlefield tapped. You get to add a green or a black mana to your mana pool, and it also has the added bonus of being a manland, which essentially means 1, a green and a black. You can pay to make Hissing Quagmire a 2/2 green elemental with Death Touch. That is still a land, so we can play tap lands on our turn and not take too much of a disadvantage because we can play basic after it as well. We also have synergies with Sylvan Advocate that gives all of our land creatures +2/+2, so Hissing Quagmire will actually 4/4. Our opponent might not want to block a Death Touch creature, so we can use it as a way of getting Primal Bella through as well to give it +8/+8. So there is plenty of ways and things that we can do. We can also use it defensively in the early game as well. And also, when we've got a lot of mana, we need a lot of places to spend our mana as well. So playing manlands, these are the only manlands we can play in this deck in green and black. But if you're playing a different colour or adding an extra colour in, then maybe you want to try that out because you want to spend your mana as efficiently as possible. There's an argument to going even higher on the land count and going all in on lands, and then you want to do manland tribal essentially, which might be something I want to try in the future. We'll see. But yes, it's pretty awesome. Use it defensively, use it offensively, and use it to spend your mana efficiently, that kind of thing. So, we have Woodland Cemetery. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. So we have many swamps and many forests. We can drop this down even if it comes into play tapped. Very unlikely. We can maybe benefit off the Ghirapur Orrery anyway and play another land after it. So we can play 2 tap lands per turn. Pretty awesome. Then we have Inventor's Fair, a legendary land. So we do not want to have 2 of these on the battlefield at the same time. It has Metalcraft, although it won't say Metalcraft, and I'm not sure why. It's probably because it's not part of the set that had Metalcraft in it, but it is essentially what it is. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life. So we can gain 1 life every single turn if we have our Tireless Tracker. A Tireless Tracker can get us clue tokens. That's the only way we're going to trigger that ability, having a lot of clues hanging around, or maybe a Ghirapur Orrery or 2. But we need 3 artifacts to trigger that. So it's not a great advantage, but you know. It also adds colourless mana, but what we really want it for is the 4 and a tap, sacrifice Inventor's Fair, search your library for an artifact card, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. You can only do this if you have 3 or more artifacts. So once we've got our clues underway, we can sort of start searching out our Ghirapur Orreries and getting advantage out of that. So yes, that essentially is another 2 Ghirapur Orreries in our deck. We then have Drownyard Temple. I've mentioned this a few times. It is a colourless mana that allows us to get it back from our graveyard. So we can sack it to Gitrog Monster, for example, to gain some advantage out of that. If we're playing against Mill, we can take it from our graveyard to get some extra landfall triggers. And that's essentially it, you know. That's why it's here. It's mostly here because Gitrog Monster will eat our lands to death if we don't run these. So that's mostly why it's there. We might struggle a little bit with colourless lands, but we have Evolving Wilds to make sure that we have plenty of basics to get from there. We then have Rogue's Passage, so this is here because Mold Hydra is not complete without his single copy of Rogue's Passage. Adds 1 colourless mana, but what it really does is pay 4 and target creature can't be blocked this turn. We can give one of our creatures unblockable, which might close out the game, or we can give a little creature unblockable, Primal Bella it up and make it a big creature. So there's plenty of ways we can work around this. So yes. And finally we have Evolving Wilds. So Evolving Wilds allows us to trigger our retreats twice. So we play it, we get a land trigger, and we sack it, get a basic, we get another land trigger. It also allows us to do our retreats at instant speed as well. So as I mentioned, with Retreat to Hagra, at instant speed we can give one of our creatures Death Touch, which allows us to kill one of our creatures if he attacks in, thinking he can't get through. If his 10/10 creature comes at our Tireless Tracker, we sack our lands, give it Death Touch. All of a sudden we're trading a tiny 1/1 or something like that for one of his creatures. But yes, that is the deck. Be sure to check out the deck tech below, the list below, if you want a more in-depth look at it. But yes, that is going to be the deck. Be sure to check out the matches that should be following shortly after this, if not already out. And as always guys, be sure to like the deck if you like the look of the deck, share it around, it helps me out a great deal, and subscribe if you haven't already for more Magic Duels content that will be following all week, so subscribe to stay tuned for that. And I will see you in the games guys. Goodbye.